Hi, today I'm going to be giving you a lecture on abortion. The first thing that I want to show you is one of the simplest ways in which we could state the argument against abortion, an argument that abortion is immoral. And what we have is just one premise and a conclusion. The premise is that fetuses are people, and the conclusion is abortion is immoral. Now, clearly, saying the argument this way might make it more persuasive, right? I can imagine someone standing up there on a stage and saying, it's a simple point. Fetuses are people. Abortion is immoral. But clearly this argument does not succeed. It has no rational strength. The conclusion has nothing to do with the premises unless there's a lot more going on, right? If someone were to give this argument, they would of course be assuming that abortion involves killing a person, that killing persons is immoral, and since fetuses are people, then that makes it killing them immoral. We'd have to sort out the difference between sometimes it's right to kill people, for example, in self-defense, and we'd have to make an argument that uh, abortion involves the killing of a person outside of the exception for self-defense. So there's a lot more than what this simplistic argument says. Not to say that the argument against abortion fails, but clearly this one fails. Or if it's to succeed, it's because there's a lot of suppressed premises, a lot of implicit stuff. So the first thing we're going to want to do, of course, is to get some of that implicit premises, the part of the argument that's going unstated, out explicitly and put it out there on and take a look to see if we can decide if it's a good argument or not. So the first thing I'm going to do is add in a couple more premises. Now this, of course, is not as complex as it could be, but it's a little bit better than the one we have right in front of us. So now I have an argument which I'm calling the right to life argument. And the first premise is still that just fetuses are people. It's so far that's not argued for, so that's clearly going to have to be argued for. But for now, we're just going to assume it. All people have a right to life. That seems pretty plausible, right? And of course, 3 is a sub-conclusion. It follows from 1 and 2. That if fetuses are people and all people have a right to life, then all fetuses have a right to life. Premise 4 is all abortions are the killing of a fetus. And premise 5 is all killings of things that have a right to life are immoral. And then, of course, we can conclude from those two premises, or at least premises 3, 4, and 5, that all abortions are immoral. Now, this is a much better argument than the one we had before. Now we have a lot more premises that it seems like the previous argument was really relying on, but just letting go unstated. And now, when we're trying to evaluate this argument and criticize it or decide if it's a good argument, we can look at each premise individually and make sure that each step is a good one. So, for example, I might be able to worry about whether all people have a right to life, or if all abortions are the killing of a fetus, or that all killings of things that have a right to life are immoral. For example, 5 seems to be troubled because we have cases like self-defense. So maybe we need to alter some of these premises. For example, that all killings of things that have a right to life are immoral unless the killing involves self-defense. It seems like you could still then make the argument you would need an additional premise that said abortions aren't done in self-defense, or most abortions aren't done in self-defense, and then we would have a conclusion that says most abortions are immoral, or abortions which are not done in self-defense are immoral. But you can see how in really examining the argument and analyzing it, it's going to get a lot more complex than the simplistic one we started with. So the first thing I want to do is, letting this argument stay the way it is examine what sort of argument, what we could add to this to try giving an argument that proves to us premise 1. Clearly, premise 1 is going to be one of the most contentious premises in this argument. And no one who thinks that abortion is moral is going to agree to premise 1, right? Even if the rest of the argument succeeds, we're going to need some more defense, a further defense of premise 1. So let's go ahead and look at a further defense of premise 1. This argument is given to us by John Scott. And so here's his argument. He says, premise 1 is all fetuses, if they were allowed to develop, would develop into things that are people, right? So fetuses, they eventually become adult humans. So they're going to eventually become people. So that premise seems to be true, or seems to be plausible, reasonable. His second premise is that there is no point in the development of a fetus at which it first becomes a person. This premise seems pretty reasonable. We might worry about it later, but it seems hard to come to a specific point, a specific line that 1 minute before this fetus in its development wasn't a person, and now it is. So it seems like premise 2 might be on good grounds too, although I'm sure that some philosophers have an issue with number 2. Premise 3, now this is a little more complex. If something were allowed to develop and would develop into a thing that had property P, and there's no point at which it first acquires property P, then that thing has had property P from the moment it came to existence. So the idea there is that if something has a property, if something is red, let's say, and there's no specific point where it became red, then it must have had red all along, since the minute it came into existence. So for example, I say I have a red ball, and if we know that there's no point where it became red, then presumably it's been red ever since that ball came into existence. There was no point in which that ball was around but was blue or some other color. So that's the sort of premise he has here in premise 3. It's this sort of general abstract principle that makes a claim about how if a pretty plausible sounding claim that if something gets a property or has a property and there's no specific point where it got it, then it must have had it since the beginning. Now you'll notice I have EPs and IPs at the end of some of these premises. By these I just mean explicit premises and implied premises. So in reconstructing the passage in which John Scott gives this argument, he pretty explicitly states the first two premises. The third one he doesn't actually give us. He just sort of, it's implicit, he doesn't state it, but clearly he's relying on it in his argument. Sometimes when people reconstruct arguments, they like to point out which premises were explicitly stated by the person and which ones had gone unstated originally. So now we have a conclusion which is supposed to show us that fetuses are people. Right? The conclusion is all fetuses are people from the moment they come into existence. And the argument is something like fetuses eventually will be people. They eventually have the property of being a person, right? But there's no specific point when they get that property, so they must have had it all along. So before I move on, I want to ask you, you might pause this video and ask yourself to evaluate this argument yourself. Do you believe each one of these premises, and do you think the argument's valid or cogent, right? Does the conclusion follow from those premises? Just looking at it myself, I think that the conclusion does follow from the premises. It does seem to be a valid argument. But then there's the real question is going to hinge on whether we think each of those premises are reasonable to accept. So I'll go ahead and let you take a moment to think about that, and then restart the video whenever you're ready. So I'm going to pose an